Yeah.
I feel like I err on the conservative side of things.
Got it. Okay. Interesting.
Because so that's kind of what a sleep consultant does. Look at your activity, look at your history, see where you may be going wrong, and make suggestions for changes and guide you through that process.
And it sounds like just the idea that you help educate families not only on what their choices are, but what that implication is.
Yes.
And that for me, gosh, I mean, that sounds like something I could have really used. For sure, and especially in those early days, because especially if you are making specific decisions about what you want for your baby and your own sleep needs or philosophies, you also, like when you're in that early parenting days and months, you're so sleep deprived too that like you can't even imagine sleeping again. And the idea, I remember feeling 2 times around that, like, even though I knew, like, oh my God, this is going to be my life for the next 18 years. This is horrible. Like, I can't do this, right? And we know that things change and things shift, and sleep also is affected by developmental changes. And we're going to hear much more about that in just a few minutes. But it just to have someone like you, Sarah, would have been really useful to have some sort of guide to help families feel like, okay, this is what's happening right now. Here are some ways to shift that. And you can do it this way or that way. And it totally just depends on your own priorities as a family.
Yeah. And on that note, like most sleep consultants, most sleep training packages don't start until 4 or 6 months. You know, those first 3 months, if you see someone on, a sleep consultant that has a newborn package, that's not sleep training. That's about, learning to read your child cues more easily. So for example, I really confused fatigue with hunger. So I kept feeding him when he was supposed to be napping kind of thing. So the newborn stuff, we teach you more of those things rather than like a cried out sleep training option. That's not what's happening in those newborn stages.
Interesting.
And letting you know, okay, at 10 weeks is when that whole witching period in the evening might start to recede. And that's when you want to try and like bump up your bedtime a little bit earlier and awake times too. The most common parenting error is keeping our kids awake too long. And in the newborn stage is really more like, just telling a parent, like, you're in charge of deciding when nap time is. So you don't want to keep your child up too long because then it's harder to get them to fall asleep and stay asleep. That's a whole sleep begets sleep idea, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so that's what the newborn stuff is. And then in the 4 to 6 months and older, that's when you start getting into like, okay, what are your sleep crutches? What's that external thing that your child needs to help them relax into sleep that they need again when they wake up, like, every 3 hours through the night? What is it? That's your sleep crutch. How are we going to tackle that to start removing it so that your child can then develop self-soothing skills, right? Those skills that we all have that help us relax down into sleep at night. And that's really what sleep training is. Educating you on sleep needs, and then how are we going to conquer the crutch, basically? How are we going to take that away so that self-soothing skills can start to appear? And then in my program too, we talk about like maintaining your milk supply if you're breastfeeding, and how are we going to manage night feeds depending on your child's age. So sleep training doesn't also necessarily mean getting rid of all those night feeds. So that's like the common misconception.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think when we go back to that misconception thing, is that what age of a child are we talking about, right? Because really most of them will be 4 months or old. And are you breastfeeding or formula feeding? Because that will affect your child's ability to have certain amount of stretches at night. And what sleep training technique are we using? Because in my world, we're not using close the door, not go back in. That's not a technique. That's just like one action. So,
okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
And again, that is something that many people do and have done. And that is absolutely fine to make a decision for your own family that you want to do.
Yes. And if you do that, and you know what, it works great for some people. I just think if you're going to pay someone to invest in coaching, that's, there do other options before you have to resort to that.
That's well, and actually that's a really important message, right? Like if you want to hire a sleep consultant, you need more of that education, like you said. And if you're going to do cry it out, then maybe just do cry it out without having to spend the money. If that's what you're going to do.
Yeah. The cry it out one is interesting because I have used that eventually.
Yeah.
So first of all, temperament, like you mentioned before, it plays such a big influence. So at least 50% of my clients are second or third time parents. What I did with the first one just doesn't work.
Oh,
or,
interesting.
Maybe it's that their lives are busier and they don't have the same amount of time to, allocate to getting their child to sleep. But yeah, at least half are second or third time parents.
Oh, fascinating.
And, there are kids I have used, after a couple of weeks of, mom's presence being there to offer reassurance, and then we're doing checks, and that's not helping either. And then we're like, I think it's time is to close the door on this one, even though I hate it. But you have given so much of your time at this point, offering physical and verbal reassurance. You've been there, you've done that. Your presence just isn't helping. This is more now about your child's temperament than setting them up for success or delivering the same consistent message, because we've done all that. And so we may resort to that, which I really don't like. And it's very rare. I might get like 1 or 2 of those an entire year.
Wow. Which speaks to your other methodologies. So that's great. Cool. Yeah. How nice that doesn't have to happen. And I think for people too, like that can be really reassuring that there are so many other techniques that sort of the general parent doesn't know, right? Because so many of those books are either the gentle attachment parenting approach, quote unquote, or the hardcore cry it out. And there's nothing in between. But it sounds like from the perspective of a sleep consultant, there are many things that you can do in between.
I think of the sleep training techniques as being existing on a continuum, where you have like the No Cry Sleep Solution by Elizabeth Cantley, which talks about fading. And then you have, more of a sleep lady shuffle, where you're in the room offering physical and verbal reassurance. And then you move further away to like an interval method, where you're going back into the room and checking. Yeah. And then ultimately on the very end is that close the door and not go back in. Right. And with the average kid, this is the hard part. How do you know if your kid is average? But more gentle ones can work if you have the time and the patience to dedicate to it and delivering that same consistent message over and over again.
It's hard, but it's there. Okay, cool.